House Energy Policy Committee will come to order. Mr. Clerk, if you would please call the roll.
Chairman Glenn?
Here.
Representatives Hout?
Here.
Barrett?
Here.
Cole?
Here.
Tedder?
Here.
Molino?
Here.
Barrington?
Here.
Griffin?
Here.
Johnson?
Here.
LaFave?
Here.
Lauer?
Here.
Riley?
Here.
Lisinski?
Here.
Dianda?
Here.
Garrett? Camilleri?
Here.
Elder?
Here.
Green?
Here.
Sneller? Here. Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Vice Chair Houck moves to approve the minutes of the last meeting without objection, so ordered. And members of the committee, we have quite a few items here before us, but we got some folks here with some time constraints. So the first thing we're going to take up is House Bill 5902, but before we do, I want to make a statement. I've had questions from committee members about what I want on this bill, but let me tell you first what I would like. What I would like to do is shoot the terrorists. I had a consumer's lobbyist sit in my office last week and tell me that if they were not treated with sufficient respect, or if their brand was pushed around in committee, they would pull the plug on this legislation. That kind of arrogance is bred of monopoly power. They get their 90% guarantee of market share. They get their 10% guaranteed profit every year, no matter what it costs ratepayers or our economy. I have a colleague who knows more than most of us what the words honor and duty mean, who believes that I may be abandoning him on the field of battle in the face of the enemy. So what I'd like to do is shoot the terrorists, but I am not willing to shoot through the hostages to hit the terrorist. We have a company that is not just unique in mid-Michigan, but unique in Michigan and unique in the United States of America and in North America in competing against the Chinese. And I think we need to be mindful of an obligation to ensure that we are in the strongest posture of competition in a global market. And we have an obligation to look out for ratepayers, because as has been presented to this committee, ratepayers are going to see an increase in their rates. The only question is how much? Consumers are still going to get their 10% annual guaranteed profit, whether ratepayers' rates go up by 0.5% or 1.5%. I have a duty to represent my constituents and a duty of honor to keep my word. So that's what I'd like. But what I want, members of the committee, is I want this bill to pass. I want it to pass without amendment. Because even though some of the amendments in a vacuum are great, that I would fully support, any amendment that causes any of the parties to this agreement to pull their support puts at risk the passage of the legislation. So that's what I want, is for this legislation to pass through this committee, to pass today, and to pass without amendments. I will be voting no on all of the amendments. I will be voting no on any attempt to adjourn the committee before our work is done. That's what the chairman wants. With that, I would entertain relevant motions on House Bill 5902.
I'll make a motion
To
to
approve the bill.
approve the bill as stated.
Okay. Motion's been made to approve the bill and send it to the floor for consideration.
Support.
Support? Okay.
We have amendments before us.
And is that after? Rules, and we don't operate under Robert's rules. So I'm told that we must bring up possible amendments first for roll call votes. So we have Representative Farrington, you want your amendment considered, that's correct?
I will withdraw my amendment.
Okay. Representative Barrett, you have amendments. Do you want those considered?
I'll respectfully withdraw them, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Barrett. Representative Barrett, you have a second. Okay. Representative Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll withdraw my amendment.
Thank you, Representative Green. We now have, without further amendments, anybody else amendments? We now have before us a proper motion to approve the legislation. I would entertain such a motion. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
We may. She is parking right now. We will be up in a moment.
Okay. We will go at ease for a few minutes to allow Representative Garrett to join us.
Thank you.
You bet. Welcome, Representative Garrett. And we have before us a motion to report House Bill 5902 to the floor. Mr. Clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Glenn.
Yes.
Representatives Howe,
Yes.
Barrett,
Yes.
Cole,
Yes.
Tedder,
Yes.
Molino,
Yes.
Barrington, Griffin,
Yes.
Johnson,
No.
LaFave,
Yes.
Lauer,
Yes.
Riley,
No.
Lisinski,
Yes.
Kayanda,
Yes.
Garrett,
Pass.
Camilleri,
Yes.
Elder,
Yes.
Green,
Yes.
Sneller.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, you have 15 yeas, 2 nays, and 2 pass.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. And to those who were concerned about this legislation, congratulations. We now have before us a package of bills. And Vice Chair Houck, if you would take the chair. There are 5 of us, Representative Barrett, myself, and 3, Representative Johnson, Representative Deanda, and Representative Robbie, who are going to join me at the table to make the presentation on those bills.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for testifying. Are you going to go in the order of the, is that how you'd like to go in the order of the?
That'd be
they are?
fine. Who's first?
House Bill 5861.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity. Members of the committee, this is the 3rd session that this legislative package has been introduced. Before I was here, Representative Verheulen was the sponsor of this particular piece of legislation. And I worked closely with the former representative from Ann Arbor on the same package last term. And we're coming back before the committee. Again, this is the first time that the committee has allowed for a hearing on this kind of legislation. It's my belief that if we're going to have a reliable and affordable supply of energy, that it has to be based on the principles of competition and diversity. We don't put all of our eggs in one basket, or in this case, in the basket of 2 utility monopolies. If something happens to the grid, the more people who are self-sufficient, who have some ability to power their own homes outside of connection to the grid, the better. It may not be the intent, but every man a prepper. Seems to me like the fewer people who are in the future dependent on the master grid, the better. Obviously, most people are motivated by the desire to save some money. And we had a decision recently by the Public Service Commission which, though it grandfathers in people with existing ability to implement solar shingles and that kind of thing, separate self-dependent sources of power, from this point forward, that new policy by the Public Service Commission threatens to put further such development out of business, and I don't think that's good for Michigan. House Bill 5861 in particular creates a framework to allow families and businesses to subscribe to a jointly held renewable energy system, or as I like to point out, every Baptist church in Bay County could decide to be co-owners of a solar array, and allow all the members of Baptist churches or every farm bureau in our respective counties could decide that every farm bureau member could have a stake, a share of ownership in a solar array, for example, from which they could derive their own power and for which any excess generated beyond each of their individual uses would get a credit back from the utility. We believe everybody ought to have the opportunity to invest in renewable energy. As you know, members of the committee, I don't believe there ought to be a government mandate on renewable energy, but if there's demand for it in the free market, I'm all for it. And I believe it leads to competition and diversity so that we are not solely dependent on the utilities. Many Michigan families and businesses either can't afford the upfront cost for renewable energy like solar on their property, but this would give them the opportunity to enter in a joint ownership as a member of their church or farm bureau or any other organization. We should encourage as much diversity as possible. Any group that wants to get together and have joint ownership would be allowed to under this bill, and they aren't currently allowed to do so under current law. So my bill provides an option for families and businesses to access renewable energy through what we call renewable energy gardens. They'd be able to buy a share of the system, receive a monthly credit on their energy bill for the output from their share. And this system would eliminate the upfront cost to an individual homeowner if it is prohibitive from their ability to be able to access this renewable type and diverse type of energy. So that's the point of House Bill 5861. And Mr. Chairman, I think I would ask if you would, because I've had the experience of being asked questions for 20 or 30 minutes after I present a bill here. So I'm going to ask your courtesy in allowing each of the other members to make their presentation, and then we'll all be prepared to stand for questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Okay, that sounds good. Now, do we want to hear 5862? Representative Dianda?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for committee for hearing this. This bill package is very important to us in the UP. We're paying over 26 cents a kilowatt for residential rates, and we can no longer afford this. My district has the most unique landscape across with these energy challenges. Because of the west end of my district, we pay 7.5 cents a kilowatt for power, because it comes out of Minnesota. And my people do not care where they write the check, as long as the money stays in our pocket. That's why I'm full support of this package. The legislation that I have would also ensure fair pricing for large renewable energy systems that would help the situation that we are dealing with to try to get the jobs in our area. Because of the larger systems, the pricing system would not include transmission costs for putting energy back on the grid in excess of what they consumed on site. Utilities would also have the option to decline the net metering for a large system if there was a value price for standard contract available. We encourage Michigan to be able to have these investments come up in our area. This would help Michigan. We cannot grow the UP on these residential rates that we're paying. We need action now, and I'm asking the committee to please consider helping this bill package, not just the UP, but this entire state of Michigan. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Rabi, House Bill 5863.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. And before I get started, I want to thank my colleagues that are standing up here with me. I think it's truly phenomenal to have this great bipartisan group of legislators that have come together around this very important issue to make sure that we're standing up for people in our state that are wanting to generate clean energy. So my bill is very closely mirrored to Representative Deanda's bill, who just spoke. And basically what his bill and my bill do, they deal with different size generations. So my bill is specifically towards smaller generators, people that are generating more home systems. And so what our bills would do more specifically is they would establish a fair rate. So the people that are generating their power are getting compensated fairly. I don't know if you remember a few weeks ago we were here talking about some of the changes that are being made at the MPSC, where we're moving sort of in the wrong direction. We're going towards people that are generating their own power getting compensated less and less and less for the power that they're generating. So basically what this does is it establishes what's called an alternative rate. And you'll see that in the policy memo where it talks about basically pushing the Public Service Commission to then move forward with actually doing a contested case proceeding where it looks at all of the advantages and costs that these alternative energy systems would bring to the system. They would have to take into account everything from, the value to the electrical provider, also the value to the other consumers, but most importantly, the value to society, the value that these solar panels bring not only to the environment, but from a jobs perspective, as Representative Deanda was talking about. We'd have to look at the full picture of the economic and societal and environmental impact that these solar and alternative energy generations would provide to the system. So we're really talking about establishing, we call the bills fair value pricing, and the goal here is really to say, let's take into account all of the advantages that these installations bring, and also let's take into account all of the costs. I mean, we're trying to be fair. We're trying to say, let's look at both sides of the coin here. And so far, what we've seen is that has not been happening. And like we talked about last time, we've been moving in the wrong direction. So this is taking us, trying to take us in a more fair direction to make sure that our people that are generating solar energy are more fairly compensated for the energy that they do produce. So thank you all for the opportunity to speak on this bill, and look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Barrett on House Bill 5864.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, members of the committee, for taking up these bills today. I appreciate it. My bill deals with the cap that's statutorily imposed on net metering right now. Currently, that's a 1% hard cap. that we have in our state, and in certain areas of our state, we've already reached that cap, actually up in the Upper Peninsula, to be exact. So, you know, a lot of times conventional wisdom would suggest that Michigan may not be the best place for solar energy, but in fact, through technological advances and other things, we found a large number of people deciding to invest in these systems on their own private property to offset some of their utility costs. This is something that I believe in for individual property rights and individual, you know, choosing of their own self-sufficiency and self-reliability. So I think these are good bills. Mine, again, specifically deals with the cap on net metering and would not impose a specific cap, but would allow the Public Service Commission to not have a cap until it's determined that it would affect the stability of the grid if you know, too many more people were net metering, for example. I think this is a fair bill to consider, and one that has been a priority of mine from serving on this committee for the amount of time that I have, is something that I think is truly important for individual rights and freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we're going to hear House Bill 5865. Representative Johnson.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to bring this bill before you today. My bill deals with microgrids. So that's kind of the idea that there are certain critical facilities, such as hospitals or water treatment centers, that they could have their own power source. They would still be hooked up to the grid in normal day-to-day operations, but when you have certain emergency conditions, they could flip a switch, be their own island essentially, and they'd be able to power themselves during those emergency times, since that is critical infrastructure. So what our bill does, it establishes the protocols for how that's going to be done to ensure that there's some standardization among utilities through the MPSC, so that way everyone can do that. And also it would allow for a report to be done on a cost-benefit analysis, so that way future legislatures can look at this and see how we should proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. And we do have Representative Lauer has a question.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I've actually got 3 questions for 3 different bills, so I'll just, you know, go in order as well. What's that?
Is that 9 or 3?
3.
3 times 3?
Yeah, exactly. Chairman Glenn, on your bill, could you explain to us how that would work? So if there was a solar array that the Baptist Church, you know, made, would they then send the power over the grid and pay some type of grid charge for that, or how do you see that playing out?
All that, as I think members of the committee have learned, is perhaps undetermined, because it seems like even on pieces of legislation where we pass laws, the Public Service Commission interprets laws differently than how we pass them. And a broad concern that I have had is it's not just 3 members of the Public Service Commission, it's any 2. Any 2 members of the Public Service Commission can do whatever they want. So the intent is that through joint ownership, people are going to have access to cheaper power. You know, I'm skeptical of the entire idea of a grid charge. It's not our intent to establish a grid charge, but the practical reality is that the Public Service Commission may in fact do so. That could be resolved in court, but the simple intention of this bill is to allow joint ownership so that they can benefit from the electricity generated and then get credits for any excess they might generate.
Okay, thank you. Next question is on Rep. Robbie's bill. So what you're saying with that is you basically want us to create or somehow put a value on the basically environmental benefit of using solar or wind, and then whoever had that would then be paid that from the utilities. Am I understanding that correctly?
Right. Basically, what we're talking about is looking at, so one of the provisions says the credit that the person generating the power would receive will be the retail rate, or in certain circumstances, a one-time rate. There would be a one-time rate schedule established based on the time of use pricing, and so that, and then from there, the MPSC would establish a contested case proceeding that would take into account that would credit the consumer under that and take into account those factors. Yeah. So yes, to answer your question.
So simple answer, yes, they'd have to somehow come up with a calculation for how society is benefiting, allegedly, basically, from the benefit of solar or wind?
Yes.
Okay.
May I add a little bit of further commentary, Representative? Let me give you an example. I think it's the state of Mississippi did a study, because what we're always told is that solar shingle users, for example, get the benefit of using the grid and accessing it, but they don't pay their fair share of costs for the upkeep of the grid. They just get to put their energy in and out, and they benefit. What the state of Mississippi, I believe it was, found that there was at least a 50-50. It was an even exchange in terms of a net basis, who benefited, who didn't. Because solar users generate, by definition, power at the hottest time of the day in the hottest month of the year, which is on the electricity market, where the prices fluctuate from second to second. That's the most valuable energy, because it's the energy that can be sold on the market for the highest price, because we're at peak demand. That's when it's hottest. That's when they generate solar energy. And so the reverse benefit to the grid, to the utilities, is they get the benefit of the highest priced electricity put into the grid that they didn't have to spend a dime on generating. And so when the state of Mississippi did the study, they found it was a wash. And so they chose not to impose a grid charge. So it's not just a one-way street, is the point that I wanted to add.
And just to be clear on this too, this bill also does take into account, as Chairman Glenn was saying, it doesn't just look at the positives. It says, let's establish a fair rate. Let's look at the positive side and if there's any cost to the grid. And as Chairman Glenn sort of pointed out, most studies that have been conducted properly show that it's either neutral or there's a net positive to having that solar, depending on what factors you take into account.
Okay. Final questions for Rep. Johnson on your bill. Can you explain the advantage of doing the microgrid over simply maybe buying a generator instead for those types of facilities?
Well, you actually could. It's not just for solar panels. Basically, it's just saying that you could have whatever power source that you determine that best fits your needs. The idea is just that you can switch that, flip the switch in emergency conditions, so that way you are your own island. It doesn't really matter what your energy source is. So it could be a generator. You could have that. And so then once the grid goes down, rather than your generator going out and just kind of the electricity is wasted, you isolate yourself from the grid so that critical infrastructure can continue to operate until everything is back up and running.
Thank you, Chairman Houck.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask, or at least raise a point with Representative Johnson regarding his bill, because you were talking about hospitals and that kind of thing. But I remember the news reports out of Florida right after the big hurricane. I don't know when it was. Seems like 6 months ago. Maybe my timing's off. But the news reports were about individual homeowners who had installed solar shingles on their roof, and all they would have had to do is flip a switch and they could power their own home. But it violated state law because the grid was down. And because the grid was down, they would violate the law if they flipped on the switch to power their own homes. That seems to be an absurd situation. So I hope the legislation would allow even individual homeowners to flip the switch, as well as hospitals and other critical infrastructure.
Representative Lozinski.
Sorry, could I just add another comment? I apologize, Vice Chair Lisinski. I was talking about specifically the grid charge and the questions surrounding that. I think it's important to note that the individual purchasing the power, so if a homeowner or some small-scale user is placing power on the grid that is excess at the time that it's being put out there, the person, 2 houses down or, in that neighborhood who is purchasing that power is paying a grid charge for that. So the grid charge is really borne by the individual who is using the power at the time that it's being used, not necessarily the person, putting it onto the grid. That grid charge is baked into the rate and everything else that the individual using that power would be paying. So I think that's an important thing to consider as well. If you have a solar panel and you're putting a few electrons on the grid, that's being made up by the individual purchasing that at the full retail rate, next door to you or 2 houses down. Thank you.
Representative Lozinski, give her a try this time.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I'm gonna ask you a question, and then I'll move on to the question I originally had. Are there any thoughts? Thank you. I think that was a good point about the grid charge that was paid there. And I hadn't thought of that before, so I appreciate that. When I'm thinking about the power being fed back up onto the grid, if the caps are raised to 500 kilowatts and then to community solar gardens at 5 megawatts, is there estimated to be any requirements that the grid needs to be upgraded to handle two-way traffic. Right now, it heads this way. If you were to raise it to 5 megawatts or to 500 kilowatts at the residential level, can the grid handle it going backwards, or is that maybe where grid charge comes in? Can a, I don't know, transformer on a pole handle 500 kilowatts or 5 megawatts from a solar garden heading back in versus the way it was designed to head to a customer?
I'm not certain. I'm not a person sophisticated enough to know how that all would operate. I can say that, to the best of my knowledge, electricity flows on the path of least resistance. So whether it's going up or going down, I don't think that the infrastructure has a, it's not like traffic, obviously, on a street where you can only go one way or the other or something like that. I think that electrons move, freely across a wire, on the path of least resistance. But specifically, when you get to a certain point, I guess I don't know for certain how that would look.
Thank you.
Well, if I could just add to, I think that's where the fair value pricing bills come in, because these bills, they require engaging all stakeholders in a study that goes over 20 years, at least 20 years, of looking at that type of thing. What are the costs and what are the advantages of establishing these systems? And so a lot of that would be built into this fair value pricing system, and that's sort of why all 5 of these bills are sort of complementing each other, because we're trying to take some of that into account as well.
So if there was a need, if you're establishing a 5 megawatt solar garden, for there to be something different done to flow power in that direction, you would see that as part of the fair value
Right,
pricing
yeah,
model?
this bill, my bill and Representative Deanna's bill try to take all of that into account, and require that the Michigan Public Service Commission review all of those factors when they're establishing that fair rate.
Okay, thank you.
And Representative, I just want to add that if that's required, awesome, because the whole question here is one of dependence. Do we really want everybody to remain, from this point forever forward, dependent on whether or not the grid's working? The more people who are independent, whether it be a terrorist act or some act of weather, the better. And if the infrastructure has to change to respond to that greater diversity and independence on the part of homeowners and businesses, great, it ought to happen.
And my point there is that when we look at who's purchasing solar panels, we know this is not the person who's already struggling to pay their electric bill. And so if there is a system upgrade that needs to be made because you or I or someone on this committee wants to put solar panels on their house, I don't necessarily think that it's fair that that's borne by someone who doesn't have the ability to afford that level of independence. So making sure that if there are upgrades that are required, that we're not unfairly burdening one residential customer class versus another.
Sure, and specifically with the grid, I think we do need investment in our grid to make it more, stable, secure, everything else. Certainly we can talk about that. To your point about who's purchasing solar panels and who isn't, yeah, it's not going to be your, person who is struggling to pay their electric bill. However, I think it's a right of an individual to invest in that technology if they choose to, and to make themselves more independent if they choose that. And I don't think we should be discouraging them from that. Other states have a much more, permissive ability for solar net metering. Or I believe there are states that have no cap at all. In Michigan, we have, basically of the 1% cap, we're only about 25% into that right now, but we do have parts of our state that have already reached that 1% threshold. So I think it's relevant. However, it's not like, tomorrow there's going to be 99% of people net metering all of the time. I think that there's time to grow into this, and that's why under my bill, the Public Service Commission has that ability to control the rate at which net metering is adopted if they find that there are instances where grid stability is affected.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Representative Wyszynski, I also want to add that the poorest member of a church, for example, could benefit from this joint ownership of a solar array and get electricity that comes from their church, and wouldn't they love that? And it's the collective that would have to contribute toward the payment of any upgrade to the infrastructure. And if the church is the collective, is one of the collective owners, they don't have to charge the poorest member any part of that, even though the poorest member could benefit from electricity.
And so that actually leads into the question that I had wanted to ask, which was the statement in your, or the part of your bill that says that the cost to the consumer for net metering or with the solar garden would be outside of the regulation of the PSC. While there may be churches and collectives who are looking at that pricing and who may take a broader view on ability to pay, what I would tend to see, I would think I would see with solar gardening, is a developer coming in, finding a piece of land that was close enough, putting in a garden and setting a subscription price. And so right now, the way that we're typically used to paying for electricity is there's a capital outlay, we fund that capital outlay, and we pay an energy charge on top of that. When I look at the community solar garden, I don't see any consumer protections in there, and so my concern would be that, I subscribe for 4 years, so I've paid the capital and the energy. I move, the next person comes in, they subscribe for 5 years, they pay the capital and the energy, but the capital part of it was actually paid off in year 3. But there's no obligation for the developer of the community solar to stop collecting capital or to price the energy on. I put the solar array next to a community that has means, and so I'm going to actually charge them 20 cents per kilowatt hour just because I know they're willing to pay that to be stamped green. And so the lack of consumer protections and and it being outside of the MPSC process in total is of concern to me. And so I would, as these move forward, would like to see some type of consumer protection put in place.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Cincy, I appreciate that concern, and I'm certainly open to anything we can do to win the support of the committee for this legislation. But I think one of the built-in protections is that, for example, if a developer were to come in and say, I'm going to put up a solar array in this neighborhood and I'm going to charge this much, any church in that neighborhood, any Optimist club in that neighborhood, any group of just neighbors could say, well, we're going to invest in putting one up and we're going to charge half that price. Competition, bring down the price for everybody. And the reference to the Public Service Commission not getting to dictate to the First Baptist Church of Midland how it operates this if they choose is in response, frankly, to the Public Service Commission deciding to do whatever they want to do regardless of what we write into law. I'm hoping that a direct statement that they're not going to have anything to do with this is sufficient, that they can't wiggle around the law.
I understand. I just know my church, and knowing the capital investment that we have and that we're able to make, I think it's more likely it'll be developers than churches that are putting in community solar gardens.
And may I just reply to one more thing that you said earlier about, affordability and grid charges and other things is, I hope that, if these bills go into effect, that we can allow more individuals to produce their own energy and put energy on the grid, hopefully at times in which it will be the most needed. That might reduce the need for us to build peaker plants that are inefficient and sit idle the vast majority of the time. And those are costs that all of us as ratepayers pay into, and those plants are used very, very infrequently. So we're paying the full cost of them and yet hardly ever using them. But we need to have them there as a capacitor for when the grid is really, really strained. You need to put your least efficient generator onto the grid for those moments that it is necessary. If we have more people net metering because the cap has been expanded and they find it more enticing, I am hoping that we can shave off the need for some of those assets as well, and we will shift that from the ratepayers who are paying for those plants that are perhaps unnecessary in the future through net metering, and putting it back onto self-investment of individuals who choose to do that. So the grid will benefit, and all of us as ratepayers should benefit because more private individuals are choosing to produce their own power, thereby reducing the need for some of these plants that are not used hardly ever.
Thank you.
Representative Elder.
Thank you, Chairman Houck. I want to tell you witnesses, you guys are out of control today. You need to respect Chairman Houck's authority. Keep popping up with your own.
I don't know if I have any authority.
No, thank you very much.
Our apologies, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Glenn, I think you indicated in your opening comments this package of bills mirrors a package that was introduced in the previous legislature? Oh.
Yes, each of the last 2 previous legislatures.
And yet it wasn't included in the energy package that was passed in December of 2016?
Never even got a hearing.
Okay. All right. Whenever I see these bills, I always have 2 overarching concerns. The first is we just did a new huge overhaul of the energy laws, and we haven't had enough time to really see what all of those mean yet, including at the Public Service Commission, which hasn't really fully vetted exactly what we told them to do. And if the Public Service Commission was here again, as they said in the past, they would indicate we're pretty sure we followed the law, because instead of talking to legislators about their individual intents, which are totally irrelevant after a bill's passed, they gave the law to the lawyers, and the lawyers said, you said to get rid of net metering. So we did that, right? And one of the bills in particular, Representative Rabi's, is which I'm going to call you Rabi for the rest of the time we serve together, is interesting because in effect it takes into account that the Public Service Commission is about to make a recommendation based upon what we told them to do, and Representative Rabi is saying, we'd like to tell you to do a little bit more so that you can then go adjudicate the thing once again. So I may eventually wind up voting for that particular bill. But the other overarching concern is something that Minority Vice Chair Lisinski touched upon. I represent a district where, frankly, people don't have the affluence to pay for their socially progressive policies. Okay, so I've got a neighborhood that's called the South End of Bay City, which has hundreds of Bushas that are living on fixed incomes, and I don't necessarily know why they should be subsidizing someone else's personal policy decisions. And I'd like to have more wind and more solar. But I don't know why retirees in the south end of Bay City should have to pay for it. So as time passes and we see that maybe we didn't get everything right in this energy package, maybe my views will change, but I still just think it's a little too soon. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Elder, if I might respond to that, I don't think there's anything compulsory about these new options that this package would provide. So I don't quite follow the concern of anybody being compelled to subsidize. It would be more of a voluntary opportunity that, as opposed to the very folks that you're talking about not being able to afford to put solar shingles on their own roofs, if their church or their American Legion post or any other organization that saw benefit and was able to come up with the resources for collective ownership, they might benefit from that. But it would all be strictly voluntary as far as I can read the legislation. And number two, I don't put, I mean, members of the committee who weren't here last session, number one, the actual language of that law we passed, with the exception of Representative Geis, who said that as a public school teacher she had learned to speed read, that was presented to us at about 11 a.m. after we had been on the floor till 5 and gone home to sleep for 3 or 4 hours, and wake up to find a 230-page bill on my phone and a vote held on it, if I remember correctly, about 1 o'clock. With the exception of Representative Geis, who claimed she had, and she may well have, to my knowledge, nobody actually read that law in its final language. And you've heard me joke before, and then I found out it was actually true. He was wearing his pajamas, that a 20-something-year-old kid in San Francisco in his pajamas was negotiating with lawyers here in Michigan, and they came up with language that we voted on blind. That's an ugly part of this process, in my opinion. So I don't put a lot of stock in that legislation, especially when we know what the collective intent of the Republican caucus, at least, was in voting for it. And then to see the PSC do exactly the opposite of what we all, it would not have passed. I can guarantee you that this current energy law would not have passed if our caucus, at least, thought the PSC was going to implement it the way that they did. In fact, they've done it exactly the opposite way of what we thought we had accomplished.
Quick follow-up, Chairman Howe? Yes. Thank you very much. With regard to subsidizing solar energy, it's an objective fact that any person that doesn't have a solar panel on the roof of their house is subsidizing everyone who does.
Oh, you mean through the grid?
Yes.
And I guess in what way?
Because we have a system in which we pretend that a solar panel on your roof is the equivalent of generating energy through one of the incumbent utilities. And that's okay. I think that's a legitimate policy choice, but it's an objective fact. So if I have people in my district that don't have them, we're subsidizing affluent communities' solar panels on their roofs. That's just
But why, I guess, I mean, I don't care where the electrons that come into my house originate from. If they power my refrigerator, flip on my air conditioner, and power my lights, I'm totally agnostic as to where they originate. I don't feel that I'm subsidizing anybody. You know, for all I know, one of my neighbors, in fact, a few of my neighbors do have solar panels. Perhaps they're putting power, 100 feet down the road, and that's coming to my house, but I don't view that as a subsidy. I am paying the grid charge for the energy that I'm purchasing over the grid, and I think there's less of an impact to the grid to throw some electrons 100 feet than to throw it hundreds of miles, for example. And there is some loss of, energy that comes over that. I guess I just don't see it as a subsidy. If I'm paying a rate that is an all-inclusive for the entirety of the grid and usage and everything else, then I'm paying for that. If a utility is putting power on the grid, that's fine. I need to use that. And if somebody down the street from me is putting power on the grid, I can use that in part too. But again, to my point to Vice Chair Lisinski, if we have folks who are investing their own resources into creating energy, we might get to a point on our grid where we're more stable, where we can offset some of these peak demand times as well. And I think that's an important consideration for the grid as well. And, you're seeing technology improve where people can store energy on site as well. So maybe a solar panel will be producing power that'll be going into a battery that will then be used up later in the day when the sun isn't out. Those technologies won't be adopted if we don't allow for them to percolate naturally through a competitive process, I feel.
Mr. Chairman, may I, Representative, respectfully, I think you and I enjoy the sport of sparring back home especially, but I will respectfully disagree. The reference we made to the Mississippi study, and Representative Robbie mentioned multiple studies, indicate that it is not an objective fact that there's a subsidy going on, but that in the Mississippi case it was considered to be a wash. Representative Robbie made reference to some studies that indicate there's actually a benefit to the grid because the utilities get the use of the highest priced, most valuable electricity in the hottest part of the day and the hottest part of the month that they didn't have to spend a dime on generating, and so that there is a net benefit to the grid, not a subsidy from the grid.
And
Mr. Chairman?
Yep, go ahead.
It's a simple matter of historical fact that when we came up with the net metering program, it was a subsidy. There's no way, it's exactly the same thing as the renewable energy portfolio. It's a subsidy. That doesn't mean it's bad, by the way. It just means that we wanted to encourage people to put solar panels on their roofs,
I don't think encourage.
and the rest of us that are a part of the collective whole of the system are paying part of that. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a fact.
I'm sorry, there are studies that say the opposite of your assertion.
And specifically as it relates to the Public Service Commission, they're a subordinate entity to us in the legislature that I believe we can craft. If we feel that they are not interpreting something that was passed into law, I don't believe that there's any timeline with which we have to wait to give them further guidance. We're elected as the voice of the people. They are subordinate to the legislature. That's why we give them instruction. They carry out the will of the legislature. If we have a different desire, I'm sure you would suggest that if a different party had power in the legislature today, perhaps some different policy would come from that. I think we could both agree. That would be the will of the people at that point. And I think we have to be considerate of the will of the people to say we are the elected representatives. We don't have to wait for the Public Service Commission to render an opinion on something before we can give them guidance on it. That's our right as legislators that is paramount to this process.
Representative Diana, you wanted to say something?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to also just to let the committee know that no one subscriber could hold more than 40% of a proportional interest in the output of the system. So it's not going to be that we're going to have people taking over these systems locally. And the other point I'd like to make so committee could say, find Representative Sarah Kimbenzi from the 109th District, Representative LaFay, and myself was at Germfast, a small town in the Upper Peninsula. Now, this town is on the same path, paying 26 cents a kilowatt, wondering where they're going to ever afford to pay $350 a month when some of them are living on $1,000 a month retired. And I guess this is what we got to start thinking about, because people out there are waiting for action to make sure that we come up with some solution. Maybe this bill package is not something that is the best, but it's a start. And people across Michigan are tired of waiting for the Public Service Commission to do anything to get these rates down. And I'm here to tell you, because we heard it. We were in a room with people that want options. They want to come up with some kind of a program because they can literally not afford the power in that community. And if coming off the grid is what it takes, that's what they want. They want the opportunity to have that freedom, because we got people that are living there that need some relief. They're talking about shutting off their power because they can't afford it. They're talking about going to a gas refrigerator because it's cheaper to buy propane at $1.26 a gallon than it is to have the power hooked up to the house. This is what's happening across rural Michigan. And I hope today that we voice this opinion clear enough to this committee so you can understand what people are going through. And I just want to say one more thing. I think of the three of us from the UP would welcome to have this committee come up there and have a energy meeting in any town in the UP to talk about these issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Lefay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I woke up this morning and I said, I'm not going to bring up the fact that the UP has the highest energy costs in the nation. I'm just not going to do it today. And you made me do it once again. To Representative Green's point, you know, I didn't have the benefit of being in the legislature last session. But while you guys were, yeah, I hear that. You know, I just wasn't here. And, you know, what's not a real popular thing to run around in your district when you're knocking on doors and say is, you know what, the legislature took care of that. I'm not gonna do anything on energy. So it's not what any of us did when they walked up to a door and talked to voters, is say, well, the last legislature took care of that problem, so I'm not going to do anything on energy. I don't think anybody ran on that platform. I certainly didn't. And to be honest with you, the energy package of last session did absolutely nothing to help the ratepayers of the Upper Peninsula. Once again, downstate interest groups and lobbyists and legislators, no offense to my friends on the left or the right side of the aisle, left out the Upper Peninsula to die in a vacuum. And everybody was all worried about the 97%. I get it. You know, Michigan's a big place. We got a lot of people. And the UP is 400 miles away. I get that. But once again, the Lower Peninsula left the UP to die with the highest energy rates in the entire continental United States. So I'm very frustrated to hear the special interests and some representatives say, well, we just need to give it more time. We need to give the ultimate wisdom of the last legislature, almost a majority of which are no longer here, by the way, whether it be through term limits or elections. I don't want to wait 2 more years. Representative Dianda, Representative Cambenzi, my predecessor, my current senator, we cannot wait for lower electricity prices. People are fleeing. So I think the point I'm trying to get to, and the question I have is, Representative Dianda, what is this going to do for the Upper Peninsula if your bill gets in?
It's going to give people freedom to be able to start moving ahead, to keep money in their own pockets. Because if we are going to be open for business in the state of Michigan, to be able to retain our current residents, to even try to think about getting more, we're going to have to come up with some better solutions, and this is one of the bill packages that I see that would make a difference.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Representative Lozinski?
I just want to follow up on that train of thought. Thinking about the Upper Peninsula, it's the one area that has hit the net metering cap, different than the rest of Michigan, where I think, as Representative Barrett commented, we're at about 0.25% of 1%, of the 1% cap, excuse me. 25% of the 1%. Thank you. Yes. Said yes too quickly there. Is there a proposal on the table, or would we want to look at specific legislation or looking at something that addresses the UP cap at this point, that it's hit the cap, maybe setting it up as a pilot program or something that sets outside that says, you know, if you hit the cap, we will see what it looks like to open up the cap, and we will test it in this area.
Can I respond to that? Representative, I do not want Upper Peninsula legislators screwing over the Lower Peninsula like they always do on energy matters,
Oh, yeah.
trying to get it their way and cutting off the rest of us.
Well, there you have it. Thank you.
There's no further questions. One more.
Mr. Chairman, first, Mr. Chairman, if I may, to conclude, Representative Elder would want to get credit for Representative LaFave's rebuttal. So it wasn't Representative Green, it was Representative Elder. Yeah. But, Mr. Chairman, I hope that the members of the committee will detect that there is some passion, albeit for different reasons. My passion is one of diversity, freedom of choice, free markets. I don't think we need mandates in the market, but let people be free to choose. There is passion represented on this panel here for concern for clean energy. My primary motivation is one of freedom of choice and free markets. Others are concerned about solar energy in particular. But there is passion here, and I would hope that's communicated on a bipartisan fashion, sufficient to perhaps win your support. And certainly it's my attitude, I suspect it is of the other members of the panel, to be open to recommendations for how to change this. It'd be awesome if we could pass this package unanimously. I mean, I think it would take a strong statement of support like that to have a chance of going all the way. And so I'm hopeful that you'll be open-minded to it, and whatever your motivation in supporting may be different, but we all come to the same conclusion: people ought to be free to choose. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
What, just, are you sure? Okay. Thanks. Go at ease at the call of the chair.
Okay, the committee will come back to order. An exemplary job there, Vice Chair Haupt.
Thank you.
I only got to do that for about 3 minutes my freshman term, and
then what happened in those 3 minutes?
oh, that's right. I upset the chairman at the time for sure. Yeah, it's been brought to my attention that one member of the committee would like to change their vote on our motion to send House Bill 5902 to the floor for passage, and so I would entertain a motion to reconsider our vote on House Bill 5902. So moved by Representative Lauer without objection. So ordered. And is another motion required to? Got to call a roll on that one. Yeah, I believe so. So, Mr. Clerk, if you would please call the roll on the reconsideration.
Chairman Glenn?
Yes.
Representatives Haupt?
Yes.
Barrett?
Yes.
Cole?
Yes.
Tedder?
Yes.
Polino? Farrington?
Pass.
Griffin?
Yes.
Johnson?
No.
LaFave?
Pass.
Lauer?
Yes.
Riley?
Yes.
Lisinski?
Yes.
Dianda?
Yes.
Garrett?
Yes.
Kim Larry?
Yes.
Elder?
Yes.
Green?
Yes.
Sneller?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, you have 16 yeas, 1 nay, and 2 pass.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. I'll now entertain a motion to report the bill. So moved by Representative Lauer. Mr. Clerk, if you would please call the roll.
Chairman Glenn?
Yes.
Representatives Haupt?
Yes.
Barrett?
Yes.
Cole?
Yes.
Tedder?
Yes.
Bolino,
Yes.
Farrington,
Pass.
Griffin,
Yes.
Johnson,
No.
LaFave,
Yes.
Lauer,
Yes.
Riley,
No.
Lisinski,
Yes.
Dianda,
Yes.
Garrett,
Yes.
Camilleri,
Yes.
Elder,
Yes.
Green,
Yes.
Sneller.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, you have 16 yeas, 2 nays, and 1 pass.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. We now have people who would like to testify, members of the committee and members of the audience. It was our intent to hold 2 hearings on this if we don't get through all those who'd like to testify in favor of the package of legislation that was just presented. But we do have people who, excuse me? From out of town. So we're going to give some of these folks first shot. Mark Haggerty and Liesl Clark with Michigan Solar Solutions. And Ms. Clark, you've been before us before, but if you would come forward, we look forward to your testimony. And we have roughly 20 minutes remaining in committee. So
I'll only use 19 of them.
yep. We have several other people that do want to testify, so just take that into account.
Yes, sir. So I'm going to just say hi. And again, Michigan Energy Innovation Business Council. I handed out to you a document that our C3 think tank, the Institute for Energy Innovation, did a year ago. So this is just the executive summary of a study on the impact of distributed generation customers on non-solar customers. So I would direct you in particular to the second page, the third bullet. We did an analysis of a variety of studies showing that because of the fact that solar operates on peak and a variety of other details that Mark can talk to you more about, we don't see a subsidization of net metering users. But we can talk, and I'm going to let Mark talk in a little more detail. So thanks for the opportunity, and I'll just hand it right over to him. The IBC board member, Mark Haggerty.
Good afternoon or good morning. My name's Mark Haggerty, started Michigan Solar Solutions over 10 years ago. We currently have 3 offices. We've opened one up in Riverdale, Michigan, one in Wixom, Michigan. We employ 16 people, and by the end of this year, we should be over 20. One thing that I'd like to accomplish today is to help dispel the rumor that's precipitated from a unified narrative by the utility companies that solar power adopters are being subsidized by those that don't. When I am sitting here talking to you or I'm at my office, the power that I'm putting on the grid is worth 300% more minimum than the power that I take off the grid at night. And that's not my valuation. That's the valuation of the utility companies and the MPSC. So there's a differential there of about 8 cents a kilowatt hour, 8.6 to be exact, that if it was designated towards maintenance on the grid, we'd be paying more for maintenance on the grid than any other rate class. I've got copies of utility bills here to substantiate that. Also, I have a copy of a screenshot from one of the utility companies that explains at times that they could, it could cost them over $3 a kilowatt hour during peak times when Mr. Glenn, Representative Glenn mentioned, is the most expensive time for the producers of solar power to produce it. So the subsidization issue is really one that kind of angsts me. Recently, one of the utility companies was approved $1 billion peaker plant. This plant's going to sit idle for about 8,500 hours a year. It's only going to be used during those times when solar's producing the most. How much are the low-income ratepayers going to pay for this plant that's going to sit idle 8,500 hours a year? I'd just like to sit here and answer whatever questions you have and justify that position I've made. If anyone has any questions.
Mr. Haggerty, do you have any studies? We referenced the Mississippi study. Representative Robbie, not Robbie. Representative Robbie said there were additional studies. Do you have any studies that actually document as an objective fact whether there's a subsidy or a net benefit to the grid?
Sure. Minnesota did a thorough due diligence on the value of solar to the grid. And of course, they're north of most of us, not our North UP representatives, but they have determined that solar in their area is worth I forget the exact percentage, and I don't want to quote, but it was substantially more than the average retail rate. North Carolina has done a study. North Dakota has done a study. Recently, California abandoned a couple billion-dollar peaker plants because of the amount of solar they have now can generate the power needed at these peak times. So I think it's more than just studies in other markets. It's facts that we have around here. The billion-dollar plant, how much is that going to cost everybody? You know, do we need it? What's going to be the cost to maintain it the 8,500 hours it sits idle? It just cascades.
You're referring to DTE's billion-dollar plant in particular?
Yes, that's the most recent peaker plant, the largest dollar value one that we've read about, but there's many more by the other publicly regulated utilities that don't go under the radar, but they don't get as much public awareness.
And if I understand correctly, it's designed to sit idle, and if it weren't sitting idle, if it was another kind of gas plant, it would be a lot cheaper.
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, too, if I may direct you to this executive summary, that's exactly what this study does. So this study looked at, and it analyzed studies from across the country to bring them all together and to understand how do different areas, different jurisdictions value solar on the grid. And I think one of the pieces of this package that's so important is it's not only energy freedom, which is an important component of it, but it's also a diversity of portfolio, which we heard from the representatives introducing the discussion, particularly Representative Johnson. So it's not just about one particular resource, it's about all these different resources fitting together and being valued fairly, which is what we get back to that fair value tariff. So if we figure out through studies at the Public Service Commission analyzing, you know, how do you accurately measure both sides, and then you set a tariff, like let's then sit back and let it play out. I mean, that's, I think, the right role, and I think the goal, I hope, the goal of the bill sponsors.
So, Ms. Clark, having not had the opportunity to read this yet, your assertion then is that it is an objective fact determined by studies that solar users subsidize the grid, not the reverse.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
I think a lot of studies are bearing that out. It would behoove you guys to look at the studies in Minnesota, North Dakota.
We'd love to have them. If you have them, please give them to us.
Sure, I could definitely forward them to you.
Because I was only aware of the one from Mississippi, so.
Yeah, seems every year that goes by, another one hits the airwaves here. But another point about these natural gas peaker plants is they may make sense to generate electricity now, but natural gas is at a 14-year low. As soon as the fleet start utilizing natural gas, all these peaker plants come online, and natural gas goes back to its historical norm in pricing. The utility companies are guaranteed profits. They're going to have a windfall as rates go up, and all the there's a margin squeeze on the lower echelon of our economic society here. Rates are going to go up substantially, and it's going to disproportionately hurt them.
Okay, Representative Barrett.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Can you give us a little insight into what other states do relative to net metering and some of these other dimensions of this bill package, so we have some context?
Sure. North Carolina is a decent case study. They have a very favorable community solar package, and they limit net metering to 2 megawatt. And they actually are the second largest in the country right now for solar adoption. You can't drive anywhere in actually Minnesota and North Carolina now without seeing massive solar farms to which lower ratepayers are getting a considerable value from that. I would have to forward you the specifics on what they're doing, more elaborate than that, but I predominantly pay attention to what's happening here.
Sure. Do you know, I guess, if other states have caps and what they are or how they're defined, maybe?
Sure. Our cap we hear is 1%. It's half for residential, half for commercial. So other states I've heard are 5%, 7%. They're substantially larger. But if there's a fair value pricing, it would seem that a cap is a arbitrary thing to have.
Any further questions from the committee? Looks like not. Mr. Haggerty and Ms. Clark, thank you for your testimony. We also have here today, who came from out of town, Mr. Jim Eggett. Mr. Eggett, if you would, from Dearborn Heights, welcome. We look forward to hearing your testimony.
Thank you. A written statement of what I did, so I'm going to try and make it short so that other people... I'm just coming to you as a husband, father, grandfather, and a retired firefighter who is a public servant who's interested in public safety. And that's, I would like to thank you for having the hearing on this bill, because obviously last term they didn't get them. In any case, the bottom line is what I don't think what a lot of people have addressed here, because I'm just going to skip over because you can read my short thing, is that I provided you with a study about the health risks of the alternatives like coal and methane. And the value, it's estimated that it costs $361 billion to $886 billion in annually, which it represents a 2.5 to a 6.0% of the national GDP. So I think going to alternative energy sources, which included the solar and the wind, would be helpful. So what I'm saying is, in addition to the renewable energy, and that could be both private and community programs, and it's strong economic drivers because other energy, solar and wind, can create jobs. So that I also provided a study for you there. Is basically these reasons that we can have a healthier, a more stable economy, and for the future of my children and grandchildren of Michigan. So I urge the passing of this set of bills, 5861, 5862, 5863, 5864, and of course 5865, to the floor of the House. Thank you very much.
Mr. Eggett, thank you for your testimony, for driving over here. It looks like we don't have any questions. So thank you, sir. And we also have now, it looks like 3 folks who are from here in Lansing, so I'll take them in order here. Mr. Rivet from the Michigan Conservative Energy Forum. And we got about 8 minutes left.
Okay. I'll keep it as short as I can. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. The Michigan Conservative Energy Forum supports the Energy Freedom Package before you for a lot of reasons, all of which I can't go into. I'm not even sure where to start. There's a lot to go through, but I guess if I could accomplish one thing today, it would be to put a harpoon through the myth that solar users and perhaps other forms of distributed generators are subsidizing the grid. And I'm from Bay City. I know the South End and the Bushes. I've served them, Kirkuska and Kilbasa, so I know who you're talking about, Representative Elder. That's my hometown as well. We don't subsidize the grid. So if I could, I would dramatically, like in an Avengers movie, put a harpoon through the myth that we're subsidizing the grid. And the proof is in this. This legislature, in the legislation from the last session, asked the Public Service Commission to do a cost of service study to determine what the appropriate charge would be for the quote-unquote subsidy that solar providers, myself included, how we are subsidized by the rest of users. Well, the Public Service Commission staff did the one half of the study, which is, are we a cost to the system when we buy electricity, like at night and other times when the sun's not shining? And they found that we're actually a 16% benefit to the grid as solar users. They didn't do the other half of the job. And the truth be told, if we were in fact being subsidized, I'm sure the Public Service Commission staff and the utilities would have provided all the data necessary to prove the claim, because I remember the big truck parked out in front of the Capitol a few years ago. Don't subsidize the solar users. It was right there parked on Capitol Avenue. It took about 3 or 4 parking meters to get it all in. Well, if that were true, the data would have come out since that law was passed, and we would have before us, as part of the Public Service Commission's order, what that subsidy is. And it didn't come out. So the proof is in the pudding that it's not there. And if it is there, let's get it out. And that's what the legislation is intended to do. Establish the fair value. every solar user, every renewable energy advocate I've known has said we're willing to pay that fair amount. So let's get it on the table and we'll do it. That's a big portion of what this legislation does. And I think if we get there, a lot of this controversy can go away. Let's just get the numbers out and get it done. And this legislation is an invitation and an opportunity to do that. I will finish then with my own Bush's statement. My grandma, because I will tell you this, the Michigan Public Service Commission did half the job.
What is a bushka?
A busha. That's a
Busha?
Polish grandma.
All right, thank
It's a
you.
grandma. That's Oma, grandma, busha. Okay. And what my grandma used to say is this: once a job has begun, do not quit until it's done. Be it big or be it small, do it right or not at all. I'll just ask the Public Service Commission, and maybe through the bumping of this piece of legislation, to get the job done right. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Representative Elder.
Thank you very much. Which meat store did you work at?
Larry's Market. God
Larry's
rest his
Market,
soul.
that's right. It's still there. It's a great store. Let me ask you this, all right? So a major part of this package is addressing the fact that the rates that those with solar panels on their roofs are going to pay is going to go up because we got rid of the old net metering regime, because the Public Service Commission has done something, regardless of whether or not someone thinks that they did it the right or not. They did what they think the legislature told them to do, and the net result is that their interpretation of the fair rates is that they have to go up, which necessarily means that before it went up, there had to have been a subsidy. Now, we can change the math formula. We can tell the Public Service Commission to do something other than what we told them to do in December of 2016, and those are valid policy decisions. But if a bill's going up because they say it's the fair rate, how can you say we weren't subsidizing the solar panel users before they came up with the new number?
Because your presumption is wrong. They did not do what they were asked to do in the legislature. And I'm just flat out telling you that's a fiction to say that they did, because they have half the study done. I went to all the work groups. Half of it came out. The other half did not. Instead, they deferred it and put it into a rate case, and they did not provide what the legislation requires that they do.
Well, and I would add to that, if I might, that in fact, we do rewrite the formula, as Mr. Rivett says, by asking them to consider both the benefits and the detriments. Instead of just one side, if you consider both sides, which other states' studies have shown actually end up resulting in a net benefit to the grid, yes, we're asking them to change the formula, to consider both sides of the equation.
We're not afraid of a grid charge or whatever the fair value will be, but let's really have it fair. Let's get it all out on the table.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rivett. And we're not, let's see. Charlotte, with Michigan Environmental Council, do you want to try and squeeze in 2 or 3 minutes, or would you prefer to wait to another day?
I'll squeeze in.
Great, come on in.
Hi, thanks so much for the opportunity. I will also be very quick. I'm Charlotte Jameson. I'm with the Michigan Environmental Council, and we are in support of the entire package. My testimony, I've written testimony that was provided to you all, really takes a look at where we are in terms of particularly solar generation in Michigan. There was a recent study that was done that showed 80% of Michigan voters say they want more solar. We've also got incredibly high residential rates in comparison to the rest of the nation. And so you would think, given those two factors and given our strong manufacturing base and kind of a growth in the solar industry, that we would see a lot of solar in Michigan. Unfortunately, we rank 32nd in the nation in terms of installed solar currently. And only just over 2,500 people in Michigan are participating in the net metering program right now. And so those two things don't really add up. And the reason they don't add up is because there are a lot of barriers that exist right now to solar. And all this package addresses pretty much all of those barriers. which would place solar on a more even playing field when it comes to competing in this marketplace. So my testimony runs through all of those barriers, and I won't, walk through each and every one of them. I think the subsidy question has been addressed fairly well. The one thing I would say to Rep. Elder's question earlier about the 2016 legislation is that I was around during that debate, and we did not touch on pretty much any of these issues. So the 2016 legislation, when it comes to renewable energy and energy efficiency, we looked at the standards, we looked at the integrated resource planning process. We kind of tried to get into a space where we're doing a cost of service analysis around distributed generation, but we didn't talk about community solar, we didn't talk about microgrids, we didn't touch on a lot of these issues. We didn't revisit the cap issue, which hasn't been revisited since the 2008 legislation. So I would say that these are all ripe for legislative action and weren't dealt with in 2016. And that is it.
All right, thank you. I don't see any questions for the committee. We also have one other person who wanted to testify. I'm going to assume that we can hold that off to another day, but let me read in the names of people who submitted cards. In support of the bill, Mike Berkowitz with the Sierra Club. Wow. I'm on the same side as the Sierra Club. Karen Farrick, City of Grand Rapids. Kara Cook, Michigan League of Conservation Voters, with whom I think I have a 0 grade. And Paul Stankiewicz of the Michigan Catholic Conference, all in favor of the legislation. And one card submitted in opposition to the legislation from Todd Tennis of the Utility Workers Union of America. And I think that's all we have today. Without any further, let's see, I need a motion. Anybody that's absent? No motions necessary to excuse absent members. The House Energy Committee stands adjourned.